If I have to give up my democracy for an AI, I'm not that interested in AI.
You wouldn't actually have most of the features of society if we weren't to be able to use data.
This is the original sin of digital technology and AI. All other problems stem from this privacy problem.
We can't go back to Eden. We just have to solve our problems, knowing that we have this destructive tool that also can lead us to great benefits.
This is Open to Debate, and I'm Xenia Wickett. Welcome to our discussion on big data. Today we're asking, is the mass collection of data a dangerous intrusion or necessary innovation? I want to start with a small confession. Like most people, I live very comfortably with the benefits of data. I like that my phone predicts traffic. I like that my bank spots fraud before I do. And I like that medicine is slowly moving from waiting till you feel ill to spotting patterns before something goes wrong. But at the same time, I feel a low-level unease. I sense that a lot is happening about me, without me. That the same data that promises insight, efficiency, and progress also concentrates power, shapes behavior, and quietly redraws the boundaries between public and private. And I'm not alone. According to the Pew Research Center, in 2023, 81% of Americans were concerned about how companies use their personal data, and 71% about its use by government. Data has become a new form of gold, and companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and TikTok are paying attention. As the old saying goes, information is power. What's changed is the scale. This is no longer just an issue for business sector, but also for governments. That tension is exactly what today's conversation is about. This isn't a debate about technology for or against, but about where and how we might draw the line. With that, I'm going to ask my two speakers to make opening statements. I have two great debaters with me today. They have debated before and are excited to spar again, I hope. First, arguing that big data is predominantly an intrusion in our lives is Carissa Véliz. She's an associate professor of Oxford's Faculty of Philosophy and the Institute for Ethics in AI. Carissa also wrote Privacy is Power, and her new book, Prophecy, is coming out later this year. Hi, Carissa.
Hi, Xenia.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And her opposition is Ken Cukier. Ken's an old friend of mine, I have to admit that, and he's the deputy editor, executive editor of The Economist and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Big Data, a Resolution.
Well, it's a revolution.
A revolution that will transform how we work, live, and think. You also used to work for the Wall Street Journal.
I did.
And I didn't bring the book. I apologize.
Totally fine.
Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. We want each of you to take a few minutes to explain your position. Carissa, you're up first. You have 4 minutes to say why big data is an intrusion.
I think the first thing to think about is whether the way we are framing questions already assumes too much, whether we are making a concession to big tech that maybe we shouldn't. And if we think that all of those innovations that you enjoy, that we enjoy, need that kind of intrusion, we might be assuming too much. So you actually can have a Maps app that works just as fine with a fraction of the data. And you can have all kinds of other innovations in other ways. Why do we have this level of surveillance? For profit. As simple as that. And there are good reasons for why we associate mass surveillance with authoritarian regimes. In fact, this is the first time in history that we see this level of surveillance in what are still considered liberal democracies. And I want to suggest that it's not a coincidence that liberal democracy is facing perhaps its most difficult moments in the past few decades at the same time as the rise of digital tech. And the Economist intelligence unit every year measures the state of democracy. And every year it looks grimmer and grimmer. It's not only that we have fewer countries that are democratic, but it's also that the quality of democracies within democratic countries is getting eroded, and we're seeing very authoritarian tendencies. And one of the problems is that code is incredibly authoritarian. There's no negotiation. It's my way or the highway. And it's very opaque. these are companies that are coming up with these rules. We are ruled by algorithm, but we don't know what the rules are. There are no way to be able to contest them or even to access them. And all of that goes against liberal democracy. So the very real question that we're asking when we engage in this level of surveillance is, how much surveillance can democracy take? And I don't want to find out, but we are finding out. And all for what? Everybody is in favor of good innovation. Who doesn't want better medicine? But can we realistically say that medicine has improved that much in the past 20 years thanks to mass surveillance? I don't think so. And a lot of the times we accept incredibly intrusive measures on the basis of a promise that decades later doesn't pan out. And how much are we willing to give up for that promise? There is no democracy without privacy. There's no investigative journalism. There's no secret ballot. There's no free elections. There's no meeting with your lawyer and having confidentiality. There's no medical confidentiality either. And we're eroding the pillars of democracy precisely at a time when we need them most. And democracy is a very interesting creature because on the one hand, it's very fragile, but it's also very robust. And the danger is that we might not notice how we are eroding these fundamental pillars of democracy. And that by the time we notice, it's too late. We've destroyed them. And that is the risks that we are taking. So what used to be considered spyware has become the most common way of funding the internet and funding these incredibly powerful companies that have become more wealthy than the agencies that are regulating them and more wealthy than many countries around the world, and most countries around the world. And we have become used to having the mass violation of the right to privacy as something normal. But that is not normal, and it shouldn't be normal.
Okay, Carissa, thank you so much for that. Ken, let me move to you. You have 4 minutes to make the argument that big data promotes innovation.
So everything that Carissa said is not wrong. Everything she said, and I mean everything she said, is correct. But she posits the value of liberal democracy as the cornerstone of who we are as a society, and I would agree with that. And if you were to extract, well, what is it that's special about liberal democracy? It's the fact that humans are applying reason, not whim, not sort of taking the entrails of small woodland animals or looking at our destiny in the stars, but applying reason. So what is data? Data is the empirical evidence of reality. It is that which was informational that humans have decided with the touch of man or woman to collect, process, store, and reuse. It's mathematics. It's applying information to solve our problems, to make the world a better place. Now, the benefit of big data is that if you have a small data point, what your hemoglobin levels, your pulse, you learn a small amount of information. But if you collect a lot of information, you can do more things. If you had medical records of the entire population going back several decades, you wouldn't have rare cases because it would be in the database. You would know something new about the progression of disease before the symptoms fully are shown. And in fact, you'd be able to staunch it because you know what treatments work with what sort of person under what sort of conditions. So in fact, I believe that humanity has a moral obligation to apply the empirical evidence of the world to improving the world. And the way we do that is with data. Now, with a lot of data, it's the bedrock of artificial intelligence. And the point here is that it allows us not simply to learn what humans already know and learn it and get the answer better and faster, but to develop entirely new insights to surpass our cognitive abilities, the ones that we have always left us stunted, and to pierce the frontier of knowledge. By exceeding human cognition, we will be able to do entirely new things and solve a lot of our problems. Now, to be sure, this is not to say that all is simply glory, that we simply can hold hands and walk into a utopian sunlight. The problems that Carissa has identified are absolutely real. There is a problem of surveillance and state surveillance, particularly in a world in which the liberal democratic norms of governments around the world, are fraying. Defense technology and the rise of killer robots, where it's going to be harnessing data to learn new things about how it can be more effective at slaughtering other people, rivets me with fear. And of course, nobody likes to be followed around Amazon with online advertisements that bother them. It's a complete pain. The risks are absolutely real. But I believe that we're a wise society that can interact with those problems and try to solve those problems. What I do fear is a world that doesn't try to do that resists collecting information and data and hoping for the best. If big data and artificial intelligence is just souped up math, nobody wants to be someone who bets against math. What we want to do is harness this technology, this tool created by man for the benefit of all humankind, and therefore to have a better life as a result.
Okay, thank you both for those very succinct and timely 4-minute introductions. Before we move on, I want to ask you both a question, and if you can give me a brief answer. In both of your cases, you've spent an awful lot of time focused on this. Why is this the most important thing? I don't mind who goes first.
Because it's the original sin of digital technology and AI. All other problems stem from this privacy problem. And because there is no liberal democracy without privacy, and writers don't do well in authoritarian regimes.
Okay, good answer.
I totally agree. Let me pick up the baton and say it is the original sin. Literally, it's eating of the fruit of knowledge. But here we are. We're naked. We have to clothe ourselves. And we have to do the best we can. We can't go back to Eden. We just have to solve our problems, knowing that we have this destructive tool that also can lead us to great benefits.
Thank you both very much. We just heard opening statements from our two debaters, and I'm going to endeavor to take a minute to sum up their key points. Carissa, I'm going to start with you. You started by saying, we're making an assumption that big data is necessary, and it isn't. We can do a lot of the things that we want to do without the collection of big data. And then your principal point was around, if you look at the trend of big data and you look at the trend towards authoritarianism, you can't have democracy without privacy.
Exactly.
So the arrival of big data is the destruction of privacy, and therefore is the destruction of democracy, or is weakening democracies. And Ken, you picked up and said, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Carissa said, but liberal democracy is all about applying reason. And applying reason is about taking data, taking facts, and using those facts. So on the one hand, it destroys democracy, and on the other hand, democracy thrives under facts, under rational thought. It can solve many problems. You fear that if we choose not to, we are betting against maths. I want to dig into this, and I'm going to start with you first, Ken. Talk about the evidence that convinces you that the gains from big data can't be achieved, as Carissa says, some other way.
I mean, this is, to me, such a foundational question that I'm left mute trying to figure out, well, what would be the argument for the counterfactual? So let's accept the fact that data, information, is the way in which we're going to have to make decisions. If not, we're going to be basing it on superstitions or an inkling in the solar plexus, as the poet Auden referred to it. So we don't want to do that. But then the question really is, why do we need so much data? And so that's actually a reasonable question, because it has a new answer. It's a new question, new answer. In the past, we couldn't collect a lot of data, And that really didn't matter because we couldn't do much with it. It was very cumbersome and hard to do. So, for example, in The Wealth of Nations, when Adam Smith tries to divine what an economy should look like, he introduces capitalism from a world of mercantilism. Many people think it's based on theories of his natural philosophy of the world, and it wasn't. It was based on information, because if you go to middle chapters are all about wheat yields in England, right, in the 1600s, 1700s. The point is that it was very cumbersome to collect it, store it, and process it. And those constraints have actually entirely gone away. The problem now is actually we collect so much of it that Carissa has written a phenomenal book about all the problems, the pathologies of the information. But at its core, if by collecting more information and applying new statistical methods to it, not the traditional mathematics that Adam Smith and Galileo and others had, we can extract new pieces of information that we couldn't do before, new insights that pierce the frontier of knowledge so that we can solve new problems. So an example would be AlphaFold. By taking several million known structures and components of a protein, we were able to infer the hundreds of millions of proteins that we didn't know the structure for. And by doing so, we can create new drugs and create new materials for it. That is a big data story. It's applying data. Now, no one objects to that because it's not personal information when I'm on a web browser. Yet it's still big data. So if you want to have a medicine that's going to save your life, or you're going to become an interplanetary species with new materials because of AlphaFold, and Google DeepMind did that and made it free, you're going to have to accept the problems that come alongside. And we have to be a wise society to fix them, the problems that come alongside the negative side, the other side of the coin, of collecting personal information and companies doing things with it that we feel uncomfortable with.
Go on, I know, I can see you want to respond. Go on.
Of course I want to respond. So first, I should say that one of the first books I read on the matter was Ken's big data book, of course. But I think it is not true that if you want to, say, analyze molecules and use big data to analyze molecules, then you have to accept mass surveillance. Absolutely not. I'm very excited to send you my new book, Prophecy, because it's all about how math is not neutral. This idea that, well, you can't bet against math, and math is just knowledge, and it's just like an objective reality, is a very old idea, typically associated with Galileo, who thought that nature wrote in the language of math. But really, when you look at the history of it, math was developed not by mathematicians, but by bureaucrats. Statistics was developed by bureaucrats to hide political decisions and made them look as value-free when they were never value-free. And so data is not information, it's an artifact. We choose what problem we want to solve, we choose what data we collect, we interpret it, and all of these are morally laden decisions. And so I would disagree that liberal democracy is based on reason. It's based on morality. And it's based in particular in self-restraint. We restrain ourselves and we restrain different powers such that nobody dominates another. If it was only about reason, you could have a very, very reasonable authoritarian regime, right? It's not about that. It's about making sure nobody dominates another.
Tempting as it is to go into philosophy, I'm going to come back to you. Don't worry, I'm going to come back to you. But I want to pick up something that Carissa said, because I think it's really important, which is data isn't neutral, right? I mean, we know that data picks up the biases that we already have. So how do you respond to that?
Thank you for pulling the red meat away from me, because I was going to go all in on morality, secularism, liberal democracy, Galileo, the origin of statistics and maths, and you're denying me that.
I am.
Love of pulling out my Excalibur. Okay, instead, the data is not neutral. Well, the answer to your question is baked within your question. We know that data is not neutral. Now, to some, that's a profound insight. To others, that's sort of a ho-hum. But the point is that the world is informational. Everything is information, but we have to deliberately decide we're going to render it into a data format by collecting it and storing it and processing it. And so by doing so, that curatorial notion, all data, there's no such thing as raw data, all data is somehow touched by theory, by bias and prejudice and optics and framing. A book that I wrote after big data to make the case that we have to get better at framing so that we can actually use data wisely. But because we know this, we can bend over backwards and take incredible steps to use data in a way that tries as best as we can to avoid or minimize those biases. It's totally imperfect, but it's the project that we must do. Now, again, data, every time that Carissa says the word data and talks about all the problems with it, I agree with her. But I also think, well, what if we substitute the word data with the word words or letters or literacy? Suddenly, the world becomes slightly similar, or because we see that actually we're in a world in which books can talk about killing other people and it could talk about loving other people. Data, too, has that characteristic in which it can be devastating, and there's huge harms with it, but it can also be advancing of innovation. And again, we need to come up with the institutions and the rules to further one and not the other.
I'm hoping that you're going to weigh in here for a second, because one of the key questions is who owns the data, right? I mean, we've got to come up, I think we agree that in moderation, there are some benefits, right? Who controls the data?
And we can't be naive. So, I mean, I love your idea of having this benevolent society in which everybody uses data very, very rationally and for good. Love that. Is it going to happen? No, it's not going to happen. So it's like saying, like, we shouldn't have any front doors or keys or any kind of security measure, because really it's just kind of putting barriers on people. And people should be good. Sure, people should be good, but that's just not the way it works. And so at the moment, the people who own the data are about 5 guys living in a particular part of the world with very, very high financial stakes and very particular philosophical views. And that is creating a huge power asymmetry and huge problems around the world. Another thing that I wanted to go back to was this idea that the more data, the better. With more data, we can do more things. I think, again, that is just empirically very controversial. And we have many examples, but one example is Google in 2015 opened a program to try to predict flu. And it didn't work, and it tried to fix it by collecting more data, and it didn't work, and it tried to fix it by collecting more data. And the contender, Gerd Gigerenzer, beat them with 1 data point. And so we have a lot of instances in which actually less data is more useful, because when you add that much data, mostly you add irrelevant data, you add noise. So it's like you have a haystack and you're looking for a needle, and most data is just adding hay to the haystack.
So I challenge you that, quote unquote, it didn't work. And then let's go to the bigger point about using search data, for example, and the benefits of, if you will, surveillance. So the story was a little bit different. I mean, the joke in the by researchers when they were sort of trying to shatter it in science was that it wasn't a predictor for the flu, it was a predictor for winter, right? And so you could use NBA basketball, which is played in the wintertime, as an equal predictor, and that could be your data point. As the numbers of games increase, so do the flus. The difference is subtle. Or actually it's not subtle, it's pretty blatant, which is when people are searching online, they're giving an implicit piece of information of how they're feeling, as opposed to when they go to a clinic. Lots of people in America don't go to clinics when they're coming down with the flu because they can't afford to, because it's expensive. They can't take the time off of work, all these other things that are intervening in it. So if you look at, as a predictor of flu, visits to a clinic, you're going to be undercounting the flu, particularly in areas of economic hardship. But by looking for symptoms, not predicting what those symptoms were, that's the genius of Google. They ran several trillion analyses of models to identify what would be the telltale signs, that they were able to identify where people are looking for, coughing or different medications, and therefore having a 1 or 2 week prediction of where flu outbreaks were going to take place. It's true the model started deviating from reality, because they weren't maintaining it. If they were maintaining it, they would have. But the point is, why is this so important? Because of pancreatic cancer, right? And the reason why is that when no one says, I think I have pancreatic cancer. In fact, there's no nerve endings there, so you don't actually know you wouldn't even know what to feel, right? The point is that you say, I've got drying skin, I have yellowing skin. You come up with all these other weird things that you wouldn't think about that in combination it's a slam dunk. This person has stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 cancer. Google, and actually it was a Microsoft research, was able to identify those combinatory signs that identify that someone has terrible cancer. They're not able to deploy this because of privacy rules, but they would be able to identify what would be the telltale signs of someone searching for something that would be able to save their life.
Part of why it didn't work is because many times people search for symptoms that they themselves don't have, right? We're pretty anxious creatures. So when somebody tells us a symptom, we also search for it. So it didn't work for all kinds of reasons. That's why it's shut down.
It's never going to be perfect. I mean, you don't want perfection.
I wasn't looking for perfection.
I want to move to a slightly different topic, because there's another bit of this that's important, and I want to come to you, Carissa, because there is clear that at the moment there is a geopolitical battle taking place around technology and AI and data. And in that battle, the advantage sits with China and India, countries with significant populations who have the ability, rightly or wrongly, to collect data. So even if here in Europe or in the United States we decide to limit it, wouldn't those countries have a massive advantage? So how would you respond to the challenge that is, can you get everybody to put the genie back in the box?
So again, I think you're assuming that with more data it's going to be a better system, but not necessarily. And it wouldn't surprise anyone if somebody in those countries had a massive epic failure. I mean, have you used AI? It fails all the time. And often when I go into a room and give a talk to a tech-savvy audience, so I'm talking about computer scientists, I'm not talking about like your general public, and I say, please raise your hand if you think AI has done more harm than good in the world. It's usually about half the room. And part of why it's done more harm is because it's very biased. And even though we could do it better, we haven't. So I don't want to shut it down. I want a better product. I'm just more demanding. I just want something that actually works.
But what would that better product look like?
Well, for one that protects my democracy. So if I have to give up my democracy for an AI, I'm not that interested in AI. For another, one that is actually reliable, that is not continuously confabulating, one that is more ecologically sound. So it's just excellence in all its.
So now you've got a lot of virtues. You've got saving planet Earth from being burnt to a crisp, saving democracy, although it's not quite certain what
protecting,
is.
Protecting or not destroying it.
Okay, fine. We want to protect Earth. We want to protect democracy. Let's go back to what the problem with AI is, right? It's really about the collection of data that we feel uncomfortable that people have. So what steps could society do other than say, we can say thou shalt not to the commercial sector. Europe has tried to do that, probably not very effectively. America hasn't even tried to do that, so it's a Wild West. More troubling still is what's going on with governments holding on to having so much data, allowing private companies like Palantir to run riot in their troves, and in the past having both the legal and the norms, the sort of the culture of protecting privacy, totally imperfectly, as we know, for example, in the Japanese internment with the census records in the 1940s. But now, today, where we have a fraying of our democratic institutions, what can we do? I mean, one thing we can easily do is that when we communicate, we use the Signal app, right, which encrypts communications. But that's definitely not enough. What else would it be? I think encryption is going to be a part of it, but it's not the full answer. And I will be honest, I do not know what the right answer is. I do know I'm definitely pro-AI because I think it's going to lead to lots of great benefits. But I am looking for, what would that answer be that we can do to sort of store our data in a way that we feel confident that it's not going to be misused?
I think part of it is innovation. I want the young people of today not to follow these old companies that have produced very unsafe and very shoddy products. So I want an AI that doesn't have to use so much data. Why? Partly because it's a hybrid system between machine learning and symbolic AI, as an example.
One of the difficulties with that is you never know at the outset what data is relevant and how you're going to want to use it. So very basic things. There's lots of businesses that were built on collecting data and storing it, for example, for billing records, that it turns out to be extraordinarily important for being able to identifying relevant content. That was the case of a Reuters product that was using LexisNexis. by looking at the time that people were looking at a legal case relative to the input queries or printing out the case versus just looking at it on a screen, they could rank the relevance of what cases were more important to certain situations than others. And that turned out to be the bedrock of a product. Now, had they not paid to save that data, again, just for basically billing dispute reasons, that they wouldn't have had that new product. So it shows that the data that we collect today, we might not know why we're going to use it in the future, but there could well be a very valuable reason.
So this leads to consent, right? And I'd love to get both of your views. Where does consent come in? Where does private consent come in? And what happens if we all as individuals go, we don't give our consent for you to use my data, but then we're effectively opting out of modern technology?
No, we're not opting out of modern technology because there is modern technology that doesn't use that data. But I agree with you that it's a problem, and consent doesn't work well in the context of data. Consent comes from the field of medical ethics, in which you're supposed to be very well informed, your doctor informs you, and you're supposed to have, voluntary ability to say no. But when it comes to data, you're never well informed because even the people who design these systems have no idea what data they're collecting or how it's going to be used in the future.
Sometime in the future, yes.
And then you can't really voluntarily say yes or no, because if you want a job or an education, but oftentimes you need to say yes to these terms and conditions that are completely unilateral and can change at any point without notifying you. So it doesn't really work. Furthermore, if I say yes to giving my data up, but it turns out that you've emailed me, so I have your data, you're not consenting if I give that, my contact list and my emails. So we are interdependent in a way that personal consent doesn't work well. It doesn't cut it.
To build on that, just the other day I clicked on a link online for a news story from Vice. They're still around. And they asked me, because I'm in Europe, I had the consent pop up asking me, would I say accept all? They wanted to share with 997 partners. And I said, no, I didn't want to actually read the article, although I wanted to. I didn't want to share it with those many people for just that reason. What's that?
I'm proud of you.
Thank you. I mean, sadly, I do this all the time, and I'm wildly uninformed as a result. But then the corollary is, why should there be a consent form for medical data? Shouldn't it all be de facto put into a pool where everyone else can learn from it?
Well, no, because medicine partly depends on public trust. And when I know that the NHS is selling my data, I stop going to the NHS.
And also, wouldn't it be anonymized data that they're selling?
You don't get to anonymize medical data, partly because you often have genetic samples. And if any data is recognizable and identifiable as genetic.
And to your point, might be used in the future. Let me, we've got a couple more minutes left, and I just want to move us slightly and say, let's get some real examples here of kind of personal or individual cases rather than generic cases. You talk about it prompting innovation. Give us a really key, real example of where innovation is moved by big data. At a personal level, how is it going to affect my or your life? Give me an example of how it's intruding in my life, how it's diminishing my life or your life or somebody's life.
Why don't I start with one? It's not personal data, but it's just to explain why data can actually be so transformative. If you wanted to create a language translator system, a computer way of doing it, you could simply upload a French and English dictionary and you'd get the right answer. Right? Or you'd get a corollary to the word illumination, you get, light. Okay. But of course, there's the word light, which could mean illumination, or it could also mean léger, right? The absence of weight. So what researchers did 20 years ago was they said, actually, why don't we use data rather than just a simple, human curated dictionary? So they used the Canadian Hansard, which is the parliamentary transcripts that are both in a high quality translation of English and French, because Canada has both languages. And so they looked at it, and suddenly now you're not looking at one word for the other, but one word in the context of the other words around it. So you now can infer what the right answer is, rather than make a hard, fast rule that could be wrong. And that was good, but it wasn't great. But suddenly the internet comes along, and then Google is able to collect all the information from corporate websites, from its book scanning projects, and lots of other high-quality translations. And now translation is almost a done deal. Now, not perfect, but it's definitely maybe at 95% accuracy, maybe not for poetry, but for most things, within seconds you could get a 100-page book translated in a high-quality translation that used to cost thousands of dollars to be done. So that's one small example that when you have a lot of data, you can do something that you couldn't do with a smaller amount of it.
Okay, and is it going to be transformative to my life?
Of course, because you can have an earbud like an Apple earbud that can do in real-time translation of a conversation you're having when you're in Greece trying to order a falafel.
Very important I get the right falafel.
So I think the most convenient life and the completely safe state, safe in the sense of no crime, is a police state. It's the same thing. So I think we should learn from other societies. And one example is Hong Kong, a very cutting-edge society, very pro-technology. And when China started to strengthen its hold on Hong Kong, you could see how it was too late. You could see people on the street trying to take down cameras because they had facial recognition. Too late. People who wanted to buy subway tickets with cash when most of the ways of buying them now are digital. Too late. And yes, you can have these systems that read incredibly well, but they're reading all of the citizens' messages and emails, and it's becoming almost impossible to, for example, anonymously protest. And without anonymous protest, you don't have democracy.
So I'll agree with that, but I'll say, look, bad people are going to do bad things. And of course, with data, bad people can do even badder things. So what is the answer? What's the solution to that?
And let me just pick up on that, and then we're going to close. But what you're making an argument that it is possible for me to go around daily life without this. So how do you respond to Ken's, yeah, but you'd have an earbud that would allow me to order the falafel in Greece?
Well, first, maybe your translation is a little bit worse, maybe. But maybe we come up with better ways of translating in which we understand the relationship between language without all that personal data. Or maybe we delete the personal data once we have the translating system. So there are all kinds of ways of doing it that invite for creativity. We've become lazy.
Can I give you a crazy personal example really quickly because it's so relevant? So how I came to this conclusion that Google Translate was so transformative is one day I was reading a book that was making reference to a German Stasi guide for its agents. And I thought to myself, gee, I wonder if I can find it online. And I could, but it was in German. And so I took the first couple chapters and I threw it into Google Translate this years ago, and I was able to get a high-quality translation within about a minute so that I could read the German Stasi's guide for espionage. Now, granted, I understand the irony of this, right? But I will say that I'm a better person for having, at zero cost and 1 minute of time, being able to be enriched by learning something about history.
And intelligence agencies couldn't be more thrilled.
We're going to bring in some other voices to ask our debaters a few questions. First, let's welcome Dr. Chris Worsham, a professor at Harvard Medical School. Chris, you've written about big data's impact on health for Time, and we're very happy to have you join us. Thank you. What's your question?
Thank you so much for having me. And you guys have talked a little bit about the role of big data in healthcare. And as you know, healthcare organizations have been collecting data on our patients for decades, but it's largely kind of left to sit unused on hard drives. Countries like Sweden have been able to conduct really impactful, powerful public health research by linking health data to other data like educational or employment records. In the US, health data is protected by regulations like HIPAA that ensure a certain level of security measures and even attach criminal penalties to its misuse. So on the one hand, these regulations are meant to ensure data is not misused. But on the other hand, for researchers like me, data privacy rules can make research much more difficult, even when it's done under the oversight of institutional review boards that ensure we're using it appropriately and ethically. So my question for you is it possible for government regulations or other types of safeguards to address concerns surrounding intrusion without stifling innovation?
Great question. Go on.
Yeah, it is possible, but good luck with that, right? I will say that one of the things that animates me is that I've spent, over a decade going around the world hearing from medical researchers saying about either the companies they were founding or the research that they were doing that was going to use data to help other people. and that they couldn't do it because privacy laws prevented them from doing that. Now, I think privacy laws have their place, and they're incredibly important, as Carissa pointed out. If there's genetic information that's disclosed or misused, that could be a problem. But I think the world would be better if we were to police the misuse of it. Granted, in the four corners of a building of a company, you don't always know there's been misuse, but once you can have very important sanctions. Criminalizing the executives, just like you would with Sarbanes-Oxley, where the CEO of the organization has to sign that they haven't misused it, and if they do, and the boards of directors, and if they do, they go to jail with mandatory prison terms for misuse of data. That would be a riveting moment for people, and I could imagine that it would enable the use of sensitive data, in this case medical data, in a way that would be protected because people would take it as seriously as nuclear secrets. Maybe that's the world we need to go to if we're going to use that form of data and get the value from it in society.
Yes, again, I agree. It's very hard to police the misuse of data, and it's very expensive. So one thing to do is to create a safer data environment in general. So for example, if you cannot sell personal data, then there's less incentive to misuse it because it's not worth so much. So doctors could use it more easily. Also, I think we should have fiduciary duties. So whoever has personal data has a responsibility to use that data for the benefit of the subject of data, and we don't have that currently. But let's also not forget that the gold standard in research, including medical research, is randomized control trials. So often when we use big data, we end up trusting what are indeed spurious correlations. And we have a huge problem with replicating research. And so in many cases, the gold standard will still be randomized control trials, which introduces another way of collecting data that is within a much safer environment.
We are in a universe of spurious correlations. If we follow your idea of having consent, we avoid some of the spurious correlations if we make it de facto sharing data in a controlled environment, in this case, medical data in a controlled environment. Because, of course, the types of people who say no to sharing consent may be of a cohort that you would miss if you were trying to agglomerate all that information.
You would still have spurious correlations, and the only way to filter them out is through randomized control trials.
That's true. You could, but actually you're more likely to have the spurious correlations under your less wise policy.
Chris, you certainly set up a debate here. Thank you for the question.
Can I respond to the notion that big data actually can be quite useful for addressing some of these questions of cause and effect when randomized controlled trials are simply not possible. And so when you have the right data and in the right setting, you actually can learn things that we otherwise would not be able to know because we can't do randomized controlled trials of everything.
Can I also pick up another point that came out of your question and your answers, particularly yours, Carissa, which is this idea of paying for data, right? How should we be treating the idea of paying for data?
Well, I don't think I have the moral authority to sell my data when my data includes your data. That's for starters. But secondly, the moment we allow the buying and selling of personal data, we create an incentive to collect as much of it as possible, because then you can sell it. And not only that, but to sell it to the highest bidder, because why wouldn't you? And those create very toxic incentives for liberal democracy. And for the same reason that we don't buy or sell votes, we shouldn't buy or sell personal data, because it gets used in exactly the same way.
That is completely preposterous. First, the analogy is apples and oranges, so I'm not even going to touch that. But we're ultimately the question is capitalism and pro and con. There's definitely lots of problems with it, but what it does is it fires the personal incentive and ambition, the animal spirits of individuals around resources so it can be used to its maximal effect. Now, there's definitely problems with it, and we need a regulatory state to actually enable it to be channeled in the right ways, even playing fields and rules to prevent misuse. But you do want people to collect data, and you do want it to be used. You wouldn't actually have most of the features of society if, for example, anti-fraud detection in banking, if we weren't to be able to use data and have people compete over getting the benefits from it.
No, it's not a question about capitalism. We don't sell or buy organs or people in capitalism.
Well, we sometimes do, actually. And sadly, I mean, none of us have to interact with that, but that is a thing.
Well, in the black market, but like no capitalist liberal democracy has that practice legally for good reason.
So you're basically arguing that you need to have data be something you can pay for, that's something you can buy, or else all of this innovation wouldn't happen. And your argument is the minute you start paying for data, people will start abusing that and it will go to the highest bidder.
Maybe not all data, and I'd want to regulate the market, but yes, the principle would be fuse the incentive of capitalism alongside the data.
Dr. Worsham, Chris, thank you so much for your question. You have prompted clearly very different feelings on this. That's fantastic. Thank you for joining us. I want to go now to Parmi Olsen, a tech and AI columnist with Bloomberg and author of Supremacy. Parmi sent in a question. Let's listen to that now.
Some would argue that even the most notorious examples of privacy infringements, like Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal, ultimately did not egregiously harm people or democracy itself. Now that AI tools offer incredible convenience and a way for people to learn more about a political party and its policies, to what extent might this new form of data exchange erode democracy, if at all?
Yeah, of course. Cambridge Analytica did things in miniature, and it didn't really quite work, and there was a lot of other reasons why Donald Trump won. It definitely was able to identify, maybe it didn't take people and turn them into racists, but it identified racists and turned them into voters. And so with the new souped-up tools, can we distort democracy to awful ends? We don't have to make it a hypothetical question. We've already seen that. I mean, we have a polarized media environment, and therefore these echo chambers of just wanton mistruths and spurious realities that have fueled the fire of populism around the world. And that is absolutely a vestige of AI that has been able to assort people and fire their most negative passions. So this is terrible. Our democracy is suffering because of AI. There's no question about it. I don't think we need to actually stop AI. I think we need to regulate the problems.
Yeah, we largely agree. And I think Cambridge Analytica was more damaging than it might seem. I think it tried to sway elections, and some people like Chris Wiley would probably say it did succeed. And even if you disagree, it introduced the doubt. And we haven't changed the rules of the game to make sure that doesn't happen. And people in Myanmar would probably say that Facebook had lethal consequences on their society. But it's also about the personal costs. So one of my favorite novelists is Toni Morrison, and she likes to make her protagonists black girls and she says that those are the most vulnerable members of society, and how we treat those members of society says a lot about us. And when you see Instagram, like a couple of days ago, I met Ian Russell, the father of Molly Russell, who took her own life. And a court decided that it was partly due to social media and what she saw online. So it's also about the personal cost we're paying.
On this last question, there's a lot of agreement. So can we just take a moment to say, where is it that we agree and where is it that we disagree? Let's start with where it is that we agree.
The harms are all too real. I don't think that we need to regulate data or prevent certain markets in data from existing. I think what we need to do is, or regulate it out of existence, right? In fact, Carissa's, in her book, Privacy is Power, her view is that there should not be the collection of data on social media platforms and internet platforms, and then the use of it, for example, for ad networks. I think that's too extreme, right? I think we should have a world in which we can do this, but within reason.
So where we agree is there has to be limits.
Yeah, exactly. The harms are all too real, but I don't think in the remedies we should find something that's more modest. It's more conservative.
And
Go on, what else do we agree upon?
Perhaps we agree that if I could offer you, Ken, AI that works better than our current AI and that doesn't use that much personal data, presumably you would be happy with that.
All in.
So the end point we want is to be able to do all of the incredible things we're doing, innovation, et cetera, but without the personal costs and the institutional and democratic political costs. Okay, so where do we start drawing those lines on regulations?
I think Ken is probably more of an optimist about how much AI is an innovation. For example, I'm worried about whether AI is going to end up worsening science. I mean, we're seeing so much slop in scientific articles and so much bad work in science and, difficulties with replicating that. To what extent? I mean, we're paying a very high price, and for what?
Is that AI's fault, or is that the idiot researcher's fault who's cutting a corner and using ChatGPT instead of doing the work?
Isn't it both?
No, not really. I think it's the person, not the technology.
The next step. What would you do? So you're essentially saying, you're both saying there are bad people in the world who are going to abuse it, right? So what's the regulatory, what's the responsibility? Who are we going to hold responsible for this? Is it the tech companies? Is it the state? Let's get a sense here of, we all agree it can do some really good things. We also all agree that there are some costs. Where are we going to put the boundaries in? What are they going to look like?
First of all, I think I would invest a lot in European tech or tech in general, American tech as well, that respects rights. We have this problem, we need a technological solution, come up with it. And you can see this in the car industry. When we told car manufacturers, look, you have to make your cars safer, their answer was actually, I think I would have bought it. Their answer was like, well, but isn't it the fault of the drivers? Just like teach people to drive and tell them not to drink. And of course, that's part of it. But in fact, when we regulated them, they innovated. They innovated with safety bags, with aerodynamics, with new materials. So I would just want better tech.
So essentially, you're saying, put in the regulations and people will find a good way to use those regulations and innovate on them to achieve the same objectives that we're already achieving.
And invest in innovation, create incentives for people to innovate technology that is compatible with democracy.
What's wrong with that?
It's totally legitimate, although this is interesting because it's actually a much softer, more polite and genteel approach than was taken in previous debates, as well as in the book Privacy is Power.
I would still ban the trade in personal data. I think that's part of it. And
all personal data.
The trade
in personal data. So in other words, instead of having like 5 different large tech conglomerates, we'd have just one, because they just create one vertically integrated enterprise, because they wouldn't have to trade it. They could keep it all in-house.
No, of course not. And obviously also the use. So you have to have fiduciary duties and so on and so forth.
Oh, so now it's the use.
I would also,
it's not just the
not
trade.
Not only, yeah. So
okay,
I'm giving short answers
it's already
here.
expanding.
But I would also ban certain kind of inferences. Part of the problems
the inferences, now we've got a third
Well, be nice.
Yeah, of course. And there are a lot more in the book.
But she's taking the rope and hanging herself, as far as I can tell.
Go on. So
you
trade.
need the conditions.
Talk about trade. So you think trade in personal data is totally legit?
Yeah, I mean, we've got diamond merchants. Why shouldn't we have trade in data? I mean, I don't. What if, for example, if the
because we don't, to an earlier point, we don't have trade in organs, livers,
or should we?
Or should we?
Well, hold a second. If Amazon can identify that Carissa loves books by Karl Marx and I love books by Adam Smith, then if I go to Le Monde's website, shouldn't they be able to target me with books on Adam Smith?
Is there any data that we shouldn't be able to trade?
I like that question.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I can't. I'm not going to be so totalizing as to say no, everything should be open for trade. I'm sure that. So first, if the data is of a confidential and certainly of a private and sensitive nature, then it would be like, for example, if the Amazon is always and Google Home devices are always listening to us, and they're listening to us because they're looking for the keyword to do it. But if they cannot hear an argument among a couple, right, and they might be entitled in the terms of use to use that data for training, and that training could then maybe be sold, I think that would be wrong. Right. Clearly, if it's going to be in your home, you should be able to say, no, that's not allowed. And in fact, because no one reads the terms of services, you probably want the legislatures to basically say, thou shalt not. I mean, you'd want the company to be moral and do the right thing, but we can't rely on that.
So you're putting boundaries in here. You need the legislators to say what should be traded and what shouldn't be traded. You need the companies to be moral and upstanding.
But we rely on that in society and lots of other domains. And it takes a while for companies to mature. And often sometimes they don't, as we know with the financial crisis. run riot. And so we do need we need civil society, we need activists, we need the media. We don't have that anymore, and we need the state, of course, to set rules.
Ken, I want to just push you on one final thing. There was a movie about 20 years ago, so I am showing my age, called The Minority Report with Tom Cruise. And it premised that there was a prediction that a crime was going to be committed and that they could predict that that crime was going to be committed. And so they could essentially lock somebody up, jail somebody before he'd even committed the crime. So how do you respond to that kind of a challenge with this?
So let's go back. So it's about the implementation. It's not about the tool. The point about Minority Report is, which is a term of art in legal matters, is it's just that. It was a minority report. Tom Cruise wants the Minority Report because the precogs, the three individuals that could see into the future, it wasn't unanimous, all three. It was 2 against 1. They wanted to know what that one person was seeing that chose not to predict the future in that way, but in a different way. So in a case of a Minority Report where there's not a unanimity, there was not a slam dunk of what's going to happen. And in fact, I think that's most things in life, that I hold out free will and moral responsibility at the edge, this asymmetric edge, that in fact, we should be a wise society that enables people to scrutinize it with more rigor and not just presume that because the algorithm said that this is going to happen, that it's going to happen.
I think that's really politically dangerous because it suggests that if everybody agrees, then it's a reality. But what I argue in prophecy is that that's wrong. When we all agree about what you're going to do next, Ken, it's not because that's innovation or that's science, but we've determined it because we're forcing you to do what you're going to do next. And that's authoritarianism.
So I believe that, having not read the book, that I probably agree with you 100%. Yeah, I mean, the world is complex, and everyone wants to use data as this sort of like magical elixir that you can take and then know the future. You cannot. It will definitely point you better than all the alternatives to what's likely to happen, but that word likely is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and we have to respect it. It's not a slam dunk. It never is.
And if we want democracy, we need uncertainty. It's only when we don't know what's going to happen, when we don't know the result of elections, that we have democracy. We require it.
The whole purpose of the whole human project of progress relies on the person who thinks differently and walks in a different direction.
Exactly.
And thinks differently. And we have to protect that. In fact, we've created the whole project for the last 400 years was to protect that minority view against the tyranny of the majority.
The ability to defy the odds.
And now I kind of hear Ken moving over to your position, Carissa. So I am going to take a moment so that we can all breathe in and out. It is now time for our closing statements, arguing that big data is principally an intrusion. Carissa, you have 2 minutes to convince us of your argument.
I think it's our job to build society in a way that allows individuals to defy the odds, to have as much freedom as possible, to innovate, and to think differently. But when we create a society that is based on mass surveillance, in which everything you do, say, search for, is collected and analyzed and can be used against you, we start bringing up subjects, not citizens, not critical citizens who feel that they have the right to speak out, to anonymously protest, and to defy their odds. And all of this surveillance system we're using for the benefit of prediction. Prediction that when it comes to human beings doesn't come for free. Because if we are able to predict the behavior of human beings, that means we're determining it. That we are politically being too heavy and not allowing people to defy their odds. And I'm all for innovation. And in fact, I think what we're living through is a crisis of innovation, that we've just become used to the kind of AI that we have, and that we are not being creative enough to think that better tech is possible. In the 1930s, in a city like New York City, there were as many petrol cars as there were electric cars. And the petrol car won for a bunch of flukes because Henry Ford was a very good businessman, because the US found cheap oil, and because the company that led electric cars was mismanaged. But it could have been differently. And we need better techs. So far from a call for banning and limiting and shutting this down, I want to call for innovation, because we deserve better tech, and better tech is possible, and the products we have are just not good enough, and they are not compatible with liberal democracy.
Carissa, thank you very much. Ken, moving to you, you're arguing that big data promotes innovation. You have 2 minutes, closing arguments.
Yeah, thank you. Chris is on the side of the angels, but I am not on the side of the devils. I'm taking a centrist view, one that's not extreme in one direction or another, that's admitting all of the problems that big data and artificial intelligence can beget, yet believes that we have a moral obligation to use it and apply it to human ends. In fact, I think what we need to do in society is shift the default setting from a distrust and a mistrust and a resistance to use data to an embracing of data in all the ways that we can apply it. And in fact, that we should have a data duty of care. That we shouldn't have a society in which medical decisions are not based on information and based on data and based on using this co-pilot of AI for the doctor to assess whether he should operate or not, or whether he should give one particular treatment versus another. But he should always go to it. And, woe betide the individual, the medical professional who doesn't use data to make that decision and tries to go it alone, freelance it with using just their human mind and their knowledge, because I don't think it's enough. I think that with more information, we can have a society that can do more things with it. Now, what do we do about the problems? I mean, we have been here before as a society, whether it is applying mathematics, whether it's applying nuclear energy and the problem of nuclear weapons, whether it's applying words and how they can do toxic things and terrible things in society, as well as doing beautiful things in society. But I do believe that we need to apply our reason and our values to it, rather than taking a more extreme measure of being resistant to it. We can say we should innovate with it and use the fruits of that knowledge as best as we can, and try to temper as precisely as we can those ways in which it can go wrong. But the default setting should be the use.
Ken, Carissa, that's the end of today's debate. I would like to thank you both very, very much for a conversation that went through philosophy and art and language and finance, incredibly wide-ranging. Carissa, Véliz, Ken, Cukier, thank you both very much for joining us. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you bringing your thoughts and your thoughtful disagreement to the table. Thank you for being open to debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to those who provided questions, Parmi Olsen and Dr. Chris Warsham. Your questions really added some interesting angles to the conversation. And finally, a big thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in to this episode of Open to Debate. As a non-profit working to combat extreme polarization through open debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, the Rosencrantz Foundation, and supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Leah Mathau. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our Chief Advancement Officer. Andrew Lipson is Head of Production. Michelle Debrasini is Head of Marketing. This episode was produced by Gabriella Mayer, Alexis Pancrazi, and Katie Perry. And the Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannuccelli, Linda Lee, and Julia Sirkin. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. And I'm Xenia Wickett. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.